I'll share my screen. All right, so we'll start, we'll use the same example. So we'll do the plane, so like a plane has some sort of, I forget what I had, like a type or something. We'll do like number of seats, probably good. And then self.seats, so you can initialize it with like number of seats. Yeah, that's fine for now. Maybe I had like the year. So we declare, right? So it's the same thing as like a function, right? You define the function and then you'll use it. So here we're declaring the class, right? And then we'll use this thing. So when we initialize it, what will we pass through? Like the number of seats is like 240 or something. And this will be my like large plane. Okay. Okay. So the idea is now that like every time that we want to store these objects immediately when we create it. Essentially, it's acting like a database, you know. So the way you can do that is, I think what we did actually was we had this thing called the store, and we have a dictionary, and then have a key of planes, and then have it point to this list right here. All right. So in order to work with this thing, you know, you can have, here's my store, and you can do store planes, right? And that's this list right here. And then we can like dot append an instance here, all right? So the instance we want to append essentially is the plane that's being created. So what we'll do is we'll append self. So now if you think of what will happen, we're declaring a store, has this key of planes that points to a list, right? This is where we're going to keep all of our plane objects. Declare the class. This time when we do plane, give it 240 seats, it's going to assign the number of seats, then it's going to go to this store and this list and add in self, right? Where self is this instance, this plane that we're creating. So I don't, like, I'll show you. If I just do this, all right, like we're not even, like we're kind of good. If you look at now the store, here's this particular plane, store planes, the first one. You can do dot dunder dict and see, okay, well this is what we just created. So what we're doing is we're using this init function, right, to say when a plane is born, add that plane to the store. The next thing we can do is essentially just like identify it, right? Give it a counter, right? So each plane gets an ID. It'll just be, like we said, it will be a way to identify a plane. So we can do self.id equals, and there's different ways to do it. Like we could look at the length of this list. We can do store planes and like the length of it. Right, +1 maybe. So that way we start, oops, this plus should be on the other side. So this way we start at the number 1 and keep going. So let's just think through this. We start with our store, right? It's empty. Now this time we're going to add an ID to each plane we create, and that ID will be the length of the store, starts at 0, +1, right? Then we add in the plane. And now the next time we create a plane, it will be the length of the store, which is 1, you know, +1 would be 2. So let's try that. So we'll declare a class. We'll say, okay, we have, you know, 200 seats. And now if I look at my planes, you see we have this instance, right, which is over here. And now if we kind of get this first one dot and look at it, you can see now we have this attribute of like the ID. All right, so you have an ID of 1. Let's do one more. Let's create another plane that has, let's say, like 50 seats, right? This guy's tiny. And now let's take a look at our store again. So this time we have 2 instances here, right? They're both in this list because we append in each instance. And now let's look at the last one. The last one, dot dunder dict, has an ID of 2, seats 50. All right, so what's going on again? Self.id, right? We're assigning the ID to be the length of the store +1. okay? And then, assign some sort of attribute, and then finally add this instance that we're creating to this list. So this thing starts at 0 plus 1, then we add 1 here, and then it goes to 1 plus 1, so the second plane gets an ID of 2. Questions about anything there? No? You sure? Okay. Let's add in flights. So you can kind of think a plane has many flights. So we'll have this flight thing. We'll have length of store of flights now. And let's just create this key of flights. Have it point to a list, an empty list. So now we have a place to store our plane objects, place to store our flight objects. We'll do the same thing, give each flight an ID. Let's say a flight is on a plane. We'll do that later. All right, we'll do that later. Anything else? Maybe like the time of the flight, or I don't know, like the pilot's name. I think the flight number. Let's do like the pilot's name. Is that fine? Or the time. Let's say the hour of day. Just to give it an attribute. Self.hour of day. And that'll just equal whatever we pass through. And now, when we're done, we want to add this instance to the flights list. All right? So what will we do? We'll start with a flight. Give it the hour of day is like 4 a.m. or something, right? And what should it do? It should assign this an ID and append this flight to this list, right? So now I create a flight, and we should see it. If you look at the store here, right, you can see it. There it is. So we do store flights. Let's just look at it. Dunder dict. And that's, this. It's the one that we just created. ID is 1. The hour of day is 4, right? That's what we pass through. So again, okay, it's the same pattern. Give it an ID based on how many flights are in the list. Send some sort of attribute. Add, when you create a flight, add it to our storage, like our location for it. Then the next thing is really to associate a flight with a plane, right? Because if you think of SQL, right? If this was like a flights table and we had a planes table, right? We'd have this ID, and we'd have number of seats. And here you'd have, ID is 1, and the number of seats is say 50. And now this is my flight number. This is a flight. A flight belongs to a plane, right? It's like this flight. If you think of one flight, there's only one plane associated with any given flight, right? So here we could put a plane ID, essentially, right? I mean, there are different ways of doing it, but this is fine. I forget if I put a plane ID or what. But here we have 1, and then here, let's say the plane ID, let's say there's 2 different planes. Here, this one has that 400-seater. And now I'm saying, okay, at 4 a.m., here's the hour of day. We flew this plane, so that would be plane ID number 2, right? And that will be 4 a.m. So this flight happened at 4 a.m., right, with this plane. And now the next thing, right, is kind of like our relations. So we'll set this up, but the next thing is going to be our relations. So if we want to see a plane has many flights, let's do one more. So this is a second flight, happened with the same plane, but happened at 10 a.m. So now if I want to find all of the flights associated with this plane, right, you can think of in SQL, select all from flights where the plane ID is 2. With Python, it's the same thing. Loop through all the planes. So the question is, find all the flights associated with the second plane. Okay? Well, I'll give it even one more. Flight number 3, plane ID is 1, and this hour of day is 2 a.m. Okay, find all the flights associated with the second plane. What should we do? Go to the store, right? And basically give me back all of the flights. I want all of these flights, right? I'm going to say for each flight in this list, return to me that flight if the flight.plane ID equals the second, it has a plane ID of 2, right? This will give me the flights just associated with the second plane. And then I'll just to close the loop, we'll take this in steps, but just to close the loop, remember this is going to be like on a plane. This is find all the flights associated with the second plane. When are you asking that question? When we have a plane object, and we're going to do something like plane.flights. So if the question is find all the flights associated with this particular plane, it's not plane ID equals 2. It's go through all the flights and only return those flights where the plane ID equals this plane's ID. So equals self.id. Okay? Because this is going to be plane.flights. So in order to find all those flights associated with the plane, go through each one of them and pick out those whose plane ID equals this plane object's ID. We'll go through it. We'll do this in steps. All right, so let's tackle that. So what do we want? We want to write a flights method. And the other thing we want to do, just put a pass for here, is we want this thing, a flight, to be associated with a plane, right? And now we'll do self.planeID equals the plane.id, right? So what we can do is kind of we need to create a plane. Let's create a couple planes, and we'll create a flight. So do this. We'll create a first plane. We'll create a second plane. Here's my first. Here's my large plane. Here's my small plane. And then I'm going to say, okay, this flight that happened at let's just make this a little, that happened at 4 a.m. happened with this small plane. Okay? And let's make another flight, first flight. And now we'll say this second flight that happened at 10 a.m. also happened with that same small plane. And we'll say the third flight that happened at 2 a.m. happened with the large plane. This, right? The large plane. And we call this the third flight. So we'll initialize them. Now we can look at our store. In our store, we can see this has 2 planes, right? The large plane and the small plane has 3 flights. Okay? So now we want to answer the question. Tell me all the flights associated with this plane. So what we're going to do is we'll call, let's say we have this large plane. We're going to do large plane dot flights. And currently it doesn't do anything, but that's what we'll do in a second. So if we do large plane dot flights, essentially what we want to do is say go through for flight in store flights. Now let's just return. So sorry, I'm messing up. This should be plane. Oh, plane has many flights. Okay. So what do we want? We want to get. Here's my plane ID. We're gonna take a plane. So say maybe get this large plane and call it out flights. And what will that do? Go through all of the flights and find those whose ID matches this large plane's ID. So go through all the flights, for flight in store flights, return the flight if that flight's plane ID equals whose ID? This guy's, right? We're gonna call plane dot flights, right? Or like large plane dot flights, but it doesn't matter. But we want it to equal this plane's ID, so that's self dot ID. So this should work. We have to return the list. This is going to give me all the flights only if their plane ID is this plane's ID. So let's take a look. Here's my large plane. What's associated with my large plane? This third flight that happened at 2 a.m. So large plane dot flights should just give me this one. Man, I think I have to reinitialize everything. Okay, there it worked. Okay, I just had to reinitialize, redeclare the class. But large plane dot flights, if you take a look at this thing, let's look at it. It should be this flight that happened at 2 a.m. Dot dunderdict. Okay, and again, it happened at 2 a.m. So how did this work? Let's do the other one, by the way. We'll do small plane dot flights, and we should get back 2 flights, which we do. And then, if you look at each of them, it should be, 4 a.m. and 10 a.m. So how did this work again? We're going through, we're calling small plane dot flights, right? And when you call this method, self is this plane, the small plane. So what are we doing? We're going to go through each one of the planes and each one of the flights and only return that flight if the plane's ID equals the small plane's ID, equals self.id, right? So we're doing small plane.flights, and the code is go through each one of the flights. To find these flights, go through each one of them, and only if a flight's plane ID equals this plane's equals self.id do we want to return it. So I'll share this collab. I know some of you still may be confused. Feel free to ask questions, but I do feel like part of it will just be spending time with this.
Just confused about self.id. Like, if flight plane dot plane ID equal to self ID, but we are not passing that plane over there. How is getting that self?
Yeah, this is a global. You're talking about. We're not passing which plane? The small plane, you mean? Are you talking about this variable or like?
Yeah, this variable, the self.id. But yeah, that's confusing part.
Okay, what is self.id? Well, it's going to depend on who is receiving the method call, right? When I call small plane.flights, self is this small plane, right? So that means, let's say small plane has an ID of 2. So now we're going to go through all of the flights where the ID is 2. Find those flights where the plane ID is 2. Why is it that? Because we want the flights associated with this particular plane. How do we do that? Well, get this plane's ID. What's this plane's ID? This thing, self, right? This is the when you're asking this object a question. So because of that, it's the attributes associated with this object. Now, if I go for the large plane flights, you're asking a different object a question. Large plane flights. Lucky for us, self changes, right? When I do large plane flights, this time self is going to be the large plane. So that'll be plane ID 1, I believe. Yeah, I think it's the large plane. Let's actually look at it. Large plane dot underdict. All right, plane ID 1 So now what will self be? When you do large plane dot flights, self is going to be this large plane, ID 1, right? So that way, self is now the large plane because that's the object that receives the method call. So now it's ID 1, and we find all the flights who have a plane ID of 1.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think now it's better. Thanks.
Right, object instance. Right, self is whatever object is to the left of the dot. Right, so at this moment, what's to the left of the dot when we go through this method? Like large plane. Self is large plane. At this moment, what's to the left of the dot? Small plane. Self is small plane. So in this case, go through all the flights, find those that have this guy's ID. At this moment, go through all the flights, find the flights that have the large plane's ID. In other words, self that, right? So that's how this whole thing works. All right, let me share this with Colab. Take your time. There's no real rush through this. This takes a moment to follow. So I'd say talk through this with your partner.